Welcome everyone to today's keynote, which is produced in partnership with the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences at Cornell. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayokono. The Gayokono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with an historic and contemporary presence on this land. This confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of the Gayokono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayokono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Today's guest is Dr. Corey Moreau, an evolutionary biologist and entomologist with a specialty in myrmecology, which is the study of ants. As a professor and exhibit curator at Cornell, Dr. Moreau has been receiving a great deal of well-deserved attention this year. Just this month, receiving the Faculty Champion Award at the 2021 Graduate Diversity and Inclusion Awards and Recognition Celebration at Cornell. Why? Well, there are several reasons, but notably, Dr. Moreau is an author for a course called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics, the Science Behind Bias. This course offered Cornellians an opportunity to contextualize the history of bias and exclusion in STEM fields. When registration opened, the new seminar filled up within hours, and the class included undergraduate and grad students and faculty from 3 Cornell colleges, and their experience spanned 9 STEM fields. The course will now be offered annually starting in the spring of 2022. Now, I know that some of you among our audience, for many of you, English is not your first language. When we say STEM, that it's an acronym, STEM, right? So we're talking about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So this will come up throughout the conversation today. Just wanted to baseline that for you all. Viewers, please join me in welcoming Dr. Moreau to today's keynote. Dr. Moreau, great to have you in today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Yeah, you bet. Audience, here's the deal. So Dr. Moreau is going to be presenting. We've got a very dense and excellent presentation to view here. Throughout, as questions come up for you, please click the chat bubble up here, and that will open your chat dialogue. You can submit questions to me. I'll be taking them throughout, right? So as your questions come up, I'll be cataloging them and stacking them up and getting them ready for our Q&A section, which is going to happen at the end of this. Yes, you are watching this event. It is live. It is also recorded. This recording will be available very shortly after. So if you have to leave tonight or you want to share this with friends, just remember that this is open and free to the world. So please enjoy either the live event or the recording or some combination of both. Corey, Dr. Moreau, in our planning chat the other day, we were reviewing the data and findings you compiled. I got to say, it's quite dense and at times a staggering presentation. So I'm going to hang back and kind of let you go for it. I'll take questions from the audience, and we'll have plenty to discuss after you wrap up. But I do want to ask you, tell us about your area of expertise in myrmecology, your research focus, your teaching, exhibit curation. You do a lot of things at Cornell. And then tell us about your journey from your background, your training, your everyday work as a professor up at Cornell to the creation of this course. How did we get here?
Sure. So my specialty is on the evolution of ants and their gut microbes. So essentially what I'm trying to figure out is why are ants so diverse? So there's actually more species of ants than all the birds and mammals added together. So that means that there's a lot of things out there to study. They're distributed globally. So we try to figure out sort of through evolutionary time, how did they spread across the globe? Why do some areas have more species of ants than others? And we use molecular and genomic tools to try to tease these questions apart. At the same time, we actually ask questions about their microbiomes or the bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms living inside these hosts and how that impacts their ecology, fitness, and evolutionary trajectory, both in sort of pathogenic ways, but often in beneficial ways. So what I'm really excited about is trying to understand how symbiosis and how these interacting partners benefit each other. So that's sort of the research part of what I do. My teaching outside of this course is focused on classes usually related to phylogenetics and evolution. So how do we infer the tree of life? How do we take something like sequence data to figure out what organisms are more closely related to who and how they spread across the globe? I also have taught a graduate mentoring class where we teach professional development to our new students. And as you mentioned, this class is sort of a new kickoff. And I'll talk a bit in a moment about how it came to be. But as you mentioned, I'm also involved in exhibits. So I'm actually the director and head curator for the Cornell University Insect Collection. It's the largest university-based collection at a Latin grant institution, and we have 7 million insect specimens. So part of what we do is we want to sort of, it's primarily for research, but we want the public to get excited about what we do. So we're going to actually be opening 2 exhibits in 2022, one on the Cornell campus and one in our local natural history museum. So I'm hoping that we will get to see you there to learn more about the work we do in insect biology. But back to this course. So as you all remember, a year ago, we were all going into sort of this global pandemic, and we're quite unsure what it would look like and for how long. And at the same time, in the United States, we were going through a lot of reckoning about sort of a lot of the racial violence that was happening in our country, and recognizing that it wasn't a new phenomenon, that this is a persistent, problem within our society. And I started thinking about the fact that, we know that it's also an issue within STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that we know that bias and racism and exclusion exists. And so I thought, what a perfect time for me to design this course. So I quickly pulled together a syllabus, outlined some ideas I had, and put forward the idea to the administration, hoping that maybe I could teach it in a year, because it's pretty unusual to get a class approved that quickly. Mm-hmm. But because of the pandemic, a lot of the decision-making had been delayed. So I was quite fortunate that I was able to implement it just a couple months after sort of envisioning the course, and then ran it extremely successfully. And we had really great participation from the students, and it received a lot of positive reinforcement. I wasn't sure whether people would want to have this kind of class or whether it would be still wanted in the future. But what we're hearing is it absolutely is.
Well, congratulations on the smash hit of the course. So I should tell the audience that throughout the presentation, I'll be sharing key URLs in the chat. So heads up for those, because Dr. Moreau is going to be pointing out several resources that'll be accessible to you all as she mentions them. So I'll let you take it away, Corey. I will be in the background taking audience questions. Thank you so much.
Great. I'm really excited to be here today. So I sort of divided the talk into 2 sections. One, I'll explain sort of the course itself, and then we'll actually get into the data and what it says about bias and racism in STEM. So the seminar that we taught, as we mentioned, it was actually taught for the first time this last fall. And the participants included undergrads, graduate students, postdoctoral research, and faculty across several colleges at Cornell. It was entirely virtual due to the pandemic. And the course filled in the first day and the first few hours of registration, which I was incredibly surprised by. We had about 50 participants in the class with smaller breakout rooms and course moderators to ensure we had productive discussions. And the undergrads were actually put into their own breakout room to limit power dynamics, because this material can be so difficult to process. So what did we actually do in the class? Well, each week we had 2 or 3 papers or other forms of media assigned around a topic. Then we would come together to discuss these readings or assignments as a group, and also in these smaller breakout rooms. And students in the course signed up to sort of lead the discussion topic for a week, helping formulate what those questions could be around the readings. And I've shared below the URL, and I believe Chris will share it as well, so you can actually see our actual course syllabus with the actual readings that we did and the media that we viewed, if you're interested in sort of diving deeper and reading this material yourself. One thing we did on the very first day of class, because some of this material can be hard to process, is we actually set some ground rules for the course. So these were sort of best practices while we were together. And the first was to remember that we're all coming from different levels of understanding around these topics. For some, these topics were entirely new. They had not heard any of this material before. And for other people, they had either been doing readings or in some cases experienced some of these things themselves. And since some of these topics could be triggering, we reminded students to take care of themselves. And if they needed to turn off their camera at any moment, that was completely okay. And then we had a list of guides for the actions in the course. And those were that stories stay and lessons leave. Since sometimes this brings up the opportunity to share personal experiences or something you've witnessed, we didn't mind if sort of the overall lesson you could learn from that story left the classroom. But we didn't want it to sort of be shared, since this could be shared in confidentiality. We asked students to make I statements if they heard something, not we statements. And we asked students to take space, but also make space for their fellow class participants. We also want to remind everyone that you're acting as both teachers and learners with this material, and that accept that some things just may remain unsolved. And it's okay to embrace discomfort and to take a moment if you need it. And this list was borrowed from the Cornell Intergroup Dialogue Project. So the topics we covered were historical racism in STEM across several different sort of themes. Then we got into what the data and bias says against women, LGBTQIA+, people of color, people with disabilities, first generation and low income students in STEM. Then we talked a bit about what is systematic racism and how it sort of is, still persisting to this day across STEM fields. And then we sort of ended on a much more uplifting note, where we identified some of the progress that's happened in reducing this racism, bias, and exclusion in STEM. And lastly, finished out of the last few courses, reading papers that had identifiable action steps that we could each do individually as departments and as institutions to achieve equity and inclusion in STEM. So this class actually got quite a lot of publicity. There's 3 articles that were written about it listed below. And in one of them, they actually went in and interviewed a bunch of the students. And so this is a quote from one of the students in the course. And what I liked that he said is, he said, "I see now that open and honest dialogue is a prerequisite for problem solving, because you can't fix something if we don't know it's broken. And we don't know if it's broken if diverse voices are not in our assessments." And I think that was really a key thing that I really appreciated from taking the course, from leading the course as well. So this is what we looked like every week, a subset of the class. And you can see that we had a really fun group that were actively engaged in the class. So now let's turn to what the actual data says. So some of this will be from those readings in the course syllabus. Some of it will be not in the course syllabus. I've tried to always include citations on every slide so that if you want to follow up in more detail, you can. So why is it that we have some communities are underrepresented in science, technology, and engineering and mathematics fields? One thing we know is it's not a problem of ability or desire. We do know that there's pay discrepancies. We also know that some communities have higher amounts of self-doubt, this so-called imposter syndrome. And we also know that there's a leaky pipeline in academia, and I will return and define this metaphor in a couple of slides. What we do know is we're not going to fix these issues unless underrepresented groups stand up for equal opportunity, but maybe even more importantly, overrepresented groups need to recognize that this is actually an issue and actively work to support underrepresented people and limit bias at all levels. So you hear people say DEI or diversity, equity, inclusion a lot, but I thought it might be important just to take a moment to define these words. So diversity is the representation of all of our varied identities and differences, collectively and as individuals. Where equity is, we ensure the fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness in access to information and resources for all, while inclusion builds a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. And I think it's important to remember that if you fix one, you don't fix it all. So maybe your institution or your department has some benchmark for diversity you're trying to achieve. Well, just because you reach that benchmark does not mean your work is done. You still have to actively work to create an atmosphere that values diverse perspectives and values all perspectives equally. That's sort of the equity and inclusion component. Now, one way that this sort of plays out is through something called unconscious or implicit bias. So implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. But we know that it can be activated involuntarily and unconsciously without one's intention or awareness. But the thing that's troubling is that implicit bias is robust and pervasive, and everyone is susceptible to it. Even people who believe themselves to be impartial or objective, such as judges or scientists. And implicit biases have even been documented in young children. And if you think you're immune, I would recommend that you go to take some of these free online tests at implicit.harvard.edu to understand where your own implicit biases are. And this is fundamental for you being able to overcome or at least limit the impact of them. You must know what they are. And I really liked this quote by Carolyn Finney at the SACNAS, which is a conference here in the United States. It's the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science, during her keynote address in 2020. She said, bias is not the same as prejudice, and it's not the same as racism, but they're close cousins. And that's why we have to be actively aware of what they are and make sure that we're limiting their impact. So what is a underrepresented minority, often called a URM? Well, at its basic, it's a historically excluded or marginalized group of people. An underrepresented minority is defined as a group of people whose percentage in the population in a given group is lower than the percentage of the population in their country, in the organization, in the department, maybe even in your science field. Underrepresentation and overrepresentation of women and racial and ethnic groups may vary by field of study and occupation, and that URMs instead include, but it's not limited to, African American and Blacks in the United States, Filipino, Hmong, and Vietnamese of Asian descent in the United States, Hispanic and Latinx individuals, Native Americans or Native Alaskans, Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, or two or more races when one is from the preceding racial or ethnic categories in the list above. And in STEM, this can often also include women. And in some cases, URM can also mean underrepresented gender expression, so sexual orientations, religions, and disabilities. So I mentioned this idea of a metaphor of a leaky pipeline. So what I'm representing here is a leaky pipeline for women in STEM, but we could recreate the same figure for any underrepresented group in STEM. So it could be people of color, it could be people with disabilities. And so essentially what we're showing here is that if you start the pipe full of water and women are the water, we would see that women represent about 50% at the undergraduate level of everyone who's involved in STEM, right? And that's pretty much on par with the representation in the United States. But at each sort of advancement in career stage, we're seeing a decrease in the number of women. They're sort of leaking out that pipeline. They're being left out at each increment. Now, this is a very easy metaphor to understand, right? It's quite intuitive that you see that by the time we get to full professors, we only have about 12% are women. Now, the reason that where this metaphor sort of falls apart is that by using this leaky pipeline metaphor, it makes it sound like it's a passive process, but it's actually much more active than that. So I tend to think of it more as like a colander or a sieve, where we're actively deciding who gets to stay in and who gets to leave. So why focus on bias against women in STEM? One, I want to highlight that all issues of bias in any regard are an everyone issue, that everyone must be at the table discussing, advocating, and working towards limiting or reducing or eliminating these. We know that there's unconscious and implicit bias against women. We know that both men and women can be biased against women, and women are more likely to be subjected to inappropriate sexual comments and advances. And since we know that these women are lost at every level, that leaky pipeline I just mentioned, we all must work to encourage and retain them. I also like to say that the women in science conversation is a gateway conversation to having more in-depth conversations around all the excluded and marginalized groups within STEM. So if we look at the proportion of people who are employed in all jobs across the United States, we can see that it's almost equal representation of men and women in employment. But once we go into STEM fields, what we see is that women only make up about a quarter of the employment within STEM, already suggesting there may be some issues. And it's not just sort of who's employed, it has to also do with compensation. So what we can see is on the right, for people who are in non-STEM jobs, on average, they make less money per hour than people in STEM jobs. But even there, what we see is that women in STEM jobs earn about 84 cents on the dollar for every dollar that a man earns. Now, if we look across different fields, and in this case, the blue bars are representing women that are employed in non-tenured faculty positions, we can see that some fields are doing better than others. The biological, agriculture, and environmental life sciences have almost, 42% women employment in these non-tenure track faculty lines. But now if we look at the tenure track faculty lines, what we see is that we have a, severe underrepresentation of women within these positions. So this is from a very recent study just published last year. And It was analyzed and written by some program managers, at the National Science Foundation. And they wanted to understand whether there was any bias in sort of who was receiving federal grant funding. But in order to assess that, the first step they needed to do was to understand what was the percentage of women employed in each field and in each sort of academic position. So you're looking at those boxes that each represent a different academic field. And then the blue circles represent men and the red triangles represent women. And what you'll notice is that in all fields at the full professor position level, we have a very severe underrepresentation of women in that rank. And in some fields, we see that even at the assistant professor rank, we already have women at very low numbers, suggesting that there's some mechanism that's either discouraging them or preventing them from participating in academia within these fields. So regarding this bias against women in STEM fields, there's an impressive body of literature that shows that most people associate science and math fields with being male and humanities and art fields with being female, that women in male jobs are viewed as less competent by their male peers. When women are clearly competent, they're often considered less likable. So this is the idea that men who show sort of leadership traits are men that show traits of being assertive are considered leaders, but when women express those same traits that are considered bossy. And people are less likely to ascribe credit to a woman than a man for identical accomplishments. And on average, people are less likely to hire a woman than a man with identical qualifications. And I'll actually give you an example of that a little later on. So it's not a women's only issue, just we have less data and less publicity for other represented groups, but I'll actually share some of what we do know. So what we do know is that white men are disproportionately employed in STEM fields. So in 2006, white men occupied 55% of all STEM field positions. And well, you might say to yourself, well, that's 2006. We've been very progressive in our hiring and in our mindset in the recent history. Well, let's fast forward almost 10 years later. And what we can see is that white men now occupy only 49% of those positions, down by about 6%. Where we see no change in the percentage of white women in STEM fields and very incremental changes for only a subset of other groups. So what we're seeing is that change is not happening very quickly. We also know that first generation and low income students also struggle in the academy. So what you're looking at are bars, the colors represent their financial need. So from purple, where they needed full financial aid, all the way through the light blue where they needed no financial aid. So this is sort of a proxy for their income status. And in the first two set of bars, what you're looking at is the first generation students in math, science, and engineering. And the second set of bars is the first generation humanities and social science students. And what we can see is that they're all doing not extremely well in their respective fields, but their socioeconomic status is tightly linked to their success. But what really surprised me when I read this paper was not that first generation or low income students were at a disadvantage during their undergraduate career, but that it was persisting to the second generation. And that's some conversation we rarely talk about in the academy. Now, if we look at people with disabilities, we can see that you're far less likely to be employed in science and engineering if you have a disability, and we have a larger percentage of people not in the labor force and underemployed. Now, if we look at the employed representation of minorities by degree level in science and engineering, so this is in all science and engineering positions, right? So not just in the academy, but sort of anybody who's employed in science and engineering across bachelor's, master's, and doctorate students. We can see that although we are seeing an increase through time, even at our best, we're only reaching about 16-17% at the undergraduate level and less than 10% at the PhD level. So really, we're sort of not taking advantage of this labor force with, a lot of skills to bring within the United States. But now if we sort of look at underrepresented people as percentage of full-time professors in STEM, so now we're looking only in STEM and at full-time professors, what you can see is that Even at our best in 2013, we're really only at about 6% employment. So really there's some persistent bias happening. And the increases since 1993 are actually very low. We also know that STEM is losing LGBTQIA plus students. So this is a study that showed that men who identified as LGBTQ were more likely to leave STEM fields. And what's interesting about this is they're not leaving the university. They're actually just changing their majors out of STEM and then still graduating quite successfully. So there's something about STEM fields that's not retaining this population. Now, if we look at women, underrepresented minorities, and people with disabilities in the academic doctoral workforce, what we can see is that we are increasing in all of these categories from 1999 to 2019. And for women, we're actually doing a lot better than we were historically. But for underrepresented minorities and people with disabilities, we're still sort of, hitting a hurdle where we're not making sure that they're engaged in these careers. So stereotypes persist. We know that women in male jobs are viewed as less competent than their male peers, that when they're clearly competent, they're often considered less likable, that women of color represent that they've had to confront negative racial stereotypes, and that Black women, more than any other group of women, report a sense of bleak isolation within STEM. And Latinx and Black women are often reported as being mistaken for janitors and admins, and men of color describe similar experiences. Asians reported stereotypes, notably the forever foreign assumption, often people assuming that English wasn't their first language, and that women and people of color are often held to higher standards of personal appearance and dress, and often in productivity as well. So this is a study that I find really interesting because what these faculty did, so these were STEM faculty in the United States, they created 2 resumes. And then they sent them out to their peers across the United States also that were employed professors. And the resumes were 50% with the first name Jennifer and 50% with the first name John. And everything else about the resume was identical. And what they said is that for their institution to hire this person as a technician, they needed to get outside feedback. And they asked them a series of questions. Were you likely to hire them? Did you find that they would be competent in the position? What would the compensation be for this individual? And would you be likely to give them mentoring or additional professional development? And across the board, what we saw was that the male named resume received a higher probability of being hired, higher amount of competence, believing in the competency of that individual, higher starting pay, and were more likely to be given opportunities for mentoring and professional development. And what was also more striking about this is that both the men and women faculty ranked the male candidate higher. But the business world has actually been studying this for much longer. So this is a study that was done in 2004 where they uploaded 4 resumes for Emily, Greg, Lakeisha, and Jamal, identical resumes across several different major US cities. And then looked at the number of callbacks that these applications got for interviews. And not surprisingly, Emily and Greg were considered far more employable than Lakeisha or Jamal. So one of the things I've been hearing since I was a graduate student and started having these conversations about women in science or about underrepresentation in STEM, I often am told, well, time will fix it. We weren't aware of the issues before, but really all we need to do now is just be patient and wait. But even in a progressive period in the 2000s, what we see is if we wait, at this rate, we'll reach just gender parity in 90 years. So really, we're going to have to take a much more proactive approach to reach parity for all underrepresented groups. So why should we all work to solve this? Well, first thing is that we know there's not currently enough trained candidates to fill all the STEM jobs out there. We also know that when we have diverse teams, we have increased innovation, increased creativity and problem solving, increased teamwork, and you're more likely to attract and retain talent. You don't have to believe me. There's actually been quite a lot of work that's demonstrated that diversity is beneficial for science. So this is a paper that was published that showed that gender heterogeneous working groups produce higher quality science, and that ethnically diverse teams also had increased scientific impact. And even in this study, they took groups of diverse problem solvers and had them compete against teams of already well-established high-ability problem solvers, and found that the groups of diverse team problem solvers could outperform the high-ability problem solvers. And if you're interested in reading more about how diversity is beneficial to science, here's a link that you can pursue more of what the data says. So another thing that we know is that women and other historically excluded groups do receive fewer scholarly awards, both in the professorial positions, but also in the graduate student positions. And so what we see is sort of the disparity across fields here. The reason I bring this up as a solution is I think that what we can each individually do is nominate deserving women and other underrepresented scientists for awards. And not just diversity awards or teaching awards or mentoring awards, but for their academic and research-based achievements. The reason that this is so critical is that we actually know that women and other underrepresented people are far less likely to self-nominate and are far less likely to ask others to nominate them. Now, one thing I want to highlight is that really everyone must work to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in whatever field you're in. Because currently what we know is that underrepresented faculty are playing a disproportionate role in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what we have to remember is that we're asking them still to be successful in all the areas and ways in which we evaluate them, and then take on these additional tasks as well. So we need to sort of spread that work around. We also know that if we only have women at a table advocating for change for women, we're not going to get very far. We need our male and non-binary colleagues at the table also advocating for equality, and that goes across all axes of diversity. So what are the barriers preventing success in STEM careers for people who have been historically excluded or marginalized? One we know is the lack of role models. We know there's a lack of publicity aimed at women and underrepresented groups. There's a perceived lack of job opportunities, and people who do enter this often feel isolation and a lack of support. We often know that there's a lack of flexibility in part-time working, and that within the academy, we have a white male-dominated culture. And for many of these individuals, they're trying to overcome imposter syndrome or their lack of confidence, and they have a lack of mentors to sort of lean on as well. But the great news is we can actually fix all of these. So how do we solve the problem? First and foremost, we need policy changes that limit the effect of our bias. This has to happen across all levels. So from your department, your institution, and then of course, national and local governments. We need to acknowledge and work to reduce our own biases. Since we know every individual has some amount of implicit bias, we each have to work to reduce it. In addition, we have to reduce the impact of bias from others by actively supporting people who are have been historically excluded. And this includes by being an active bystander, and I'll define that in a couple of slides. So some of the things that we can do are things like priming. So priming is this by consciously priming, people pay attention to potential areas of bias. And so you can actually encourage yourself to be more conscious during decision-making processes. So for example, let's say you take your implicit bias test and you find that you're biased against women. So before you go into any decision-making activity, so whether it's hiring or recruitment, you'll to remind yourself, I know that I have a bias against women. I need to limit that during this activity. And data has shown that this can be effective in the short term for limiting the impact of that bias. We need to organize structures and systems so that we can ensure that there's consistency in how these processes are carried out so that you can encourage less biased behavior. And we need new forms of accountability. So we need to use diversity metrics to check for potential bias to identify when and if there are breakdowns in the system occurring. So what is an ally? I'm sure many of you have heard this phrase thrown around. Well, an ally is someone from a non-marginalized group that uses their privilege to advocate for a marginalized group. They transfer the benefits of their privilege to those who lack it. You can only be an ally through action. So I like to say, remember that it's more of a verb than a noun. But there's also performative allyship. And this is when someone from that same non-marginalized group professes support and solidarity with a marginalized group in a way that isn't helpful or actively harms that group. Performative allyship usually involves the ally receiving some kind of award on social media or a virtual pat on the back for being a good person or being on the right side. So I like these 5 tips from Francesca Ramsey on how to be an ally. The very first thing is you have to understand your privilege. And each individual has different privilege and different number of privileges. Now, it doesn't mean you were rich or that you had an easy life or you've never had to work hard. It just means that there's some things in life you will never experience or have to think about because of who you are. You need to listen and do your homework. You need to speak up, but not over. And you will make mistakes and apologize if you do. It's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And I want to reiterate that. It's not about your intent, it's about your impact. And again, remembering that ally is a verb. So saying you're an ally is not enough. You have to do the work in steps 1 through 4 above. So before we can talk about being an active bystander, first I'd like to define just what a bystander is. So a bystander is a person who observes a conflict or unacceptable behavior. It might be something serious or minor, one time or repeated, but the bystander knows that the behavior is destructive or likely to make a bad situation worse. Where an active bystander takes steps that can make a difference. Now remember, if it's unwanted, it's harassment. And people often think harassment is only sexual in nature. That's not in fact true. Microaggressions are a form of harassment. Stereotyping can be a form of harassment. So remember that if it's unwanted, it's harassment. And harassment is always defined from the point of view of the target. And again, the intent is not important. So how do you actually be an active bystander? So there's some strategies for in the moment, and there's some strategies for after the fact. So in the moment, the very first thing you can do is name or acknowledge an offense, but always talk about it from your own point of view, not the target's. This is that idea of making I statements, not we statements. You can interrupt the behavior. You can publicly support the person that was the target, or you can remove the target or harasser from the situation. So I'll give a couple of examples relevant to STEM. Let's imagine we're at a scientific conference and we're at the poster session and everyone's standing around, talking about the latest findings that they saw. And someone in the group starts to tell a joke that you can tell has bias in it in some way. Maybe it's a form of sexism or racism. And so what you can do is you can say, I'd like to stop you right there. I find this joke offensive, even if you're not the target of the joke, right? That's an example of sort of, handling it in the moment. Another example might be maybe we're at that same poster session and you look over and you see a younger colleague who's standing there trying to explain their science, but the person who's listening to them is maybe leaning in some inappropriate ways, maybe trying to touch the person presenting who looks uncomfortable. There you can actually go in and remove the target or the harasser. So maybe you say to the target, hey, listen, I'm presenting a poster too, but I wanted to make a quick run to the restroom. Do you want to go with me? Or maybe you know who the person is who's the harasser. Maybe they're a big name in your field. So you could go over and say, oh, excuse me, so-and-so. I read your latest work. Could we talk about that for just a moment? So sort of just breaking up the situation. Now, after the fact, of course, you can report the incident with or without names. In some cases, if you believe that it's a one-time event, maybe you talk privately with the harasser and hope to sort of, decrease the chances of this kind of behavior happening again in the future. You might also want to talk privately with the target to let them know that you're aware of what happened and that you're there to support them if they need it. And if you're interested in additional ways to be an active bystander, there's a URL along the bottom. The other thing that I think everyone in STEM can do is join a diversity in science group. There's many at your own institutions, but also there's national and international societies that promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I actually encourage both men and women to participate. And even if you don't identify with any of the groups, I'm actually a member with many of the organizations that you see here on this screen. And I'll actually share a personal story. So I had been involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives for a long time, particularly around women in science. And one of my close friends is involved with SOCNIS. As I mentioned before, this is the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. It's now the biggest diversity conference in the United States. And I knew that she had been participating in this conference for a long time. And she was like, hey, you should come to this conference next time. And I was like, well, I'm not any of those identities. And she's like, Well, we always want allies there, dummy. And I just realized, like, in all of my women in science work, I've always been inclusive, and having men engaged in those conversations, realizing we could only advance these issues if everyone participates. So I went out and bought a lifetime membership to SOCNUS that day, and now go to the conference every year, because I recognized that it was a fallacy in my mindset. So hopefully all of you will join one or more diversity in science groups. So just to sum up, how do we solve these issues? First and foremost, we need to support policy changes that limit, reduce, or remove bias. We need to be aware of our biases both individually and collectively, and work to overcome them. We need to encourage and support underrepresented groups in STEM fields. We need to serve as mentors and role models, and this is very important. You should serve as one or find one if you need one. We need to nominate women and other people of color and underrepresented scientists for awards. We need to ensure diversity on all admissions, hiring, promotions, and other decision-making committees. And every one of us should join and support women in science and diversity groups, regardless of your own identity. And lastly, I just want to remind you that being an ally is an action, not an identity. So I really hope that you were able to sort of learn a lot while I gave this presentation. And I look forward to hearing all of your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moreau. There's a lot of chatter going on, especially related to a couple of things that you just talked about moments ago. So I'm going to ask for a little bit of clarity. Thank you so much. Show Friend asked about your lifetime membership to what org. Gwen chimed in and said SACNAS, right? SACNAS. Can you tell us a little bit more about the organization and what it means to become a lifetime member?
Absolutely. So it's an annual conference, like many other conferences, right? Where in this case, people present their research, but there's also a whole bunch of professional development that happens there, right? So teaching people how to apply for grants and how do we get engaged in new kinds of research? How do we limit our own biases? But this organization was actually started originally as sort of the offset to ABRACAMS, which I'm not going to remember the definition of ABRACAMS, but it's mostly African-American and other underrepresented groups in medical fields. And there was a need for all the other STEM-related fields to have a diversity sort of component. And so that was where its outgrowth initiated, but now it represents all underrepresented groups across all STEM fields. And it's an amazing conference held annually, and I highly recommend everyone go. So of course you can just attend one conference, or you could be a member just for a year. But of course there's also an opportunity to become a lifetime member, which is what I took advantage of, so that I'm showing them that I support what they're doing in perpetuity.
Thank you so much. Lots of great consequent action in there. Flozel shared BWise, Black Women in Science and Engineering. Gwen shared MANRRS and so on, right? So good, fruitful, interesting chatter going on. Okay, so I had some questions come. It's been a little while since we saw the screenshot of the composition of your class. We should note that I think it was capped at 35 people for the first kind of flagship running of the course. So LM asked very early on, it looks like most of the students were women based on your screenshot. Can you talk about the composition and then ways to engage men in these topics? What was roughly the composition? What kind of dynamic was at play when you first launched it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because, these are people who are self-selecting to participate in this course, right? So that's one thing that we see. The composition was slightly biased towards women, but not as much as captured in the screenshot. And although we were capped at 35 students, we did have additional postdocs and faculty who participated, so our number was closer to 50. And then thinking about the fact that, of course, these are people who are opting in to have these conversations. Now, I will tell you, some of them had never had any of these conversations, while others were actively involved in these conversations in their own departments. So there was a lot of variation in sort of where people were coming from. But I should note that Cornell is in the process of decision-making around whether we will have an anti-racism class required for all students at Cornell. And it looks as though that's likely to go forward in the very near future. So it will no longer be an opt-in option, right? So there'll be, a very formal course around the history of racism and bias in the United States. So everyone will start with some amount of knowledge if they then choose to enroll in my course.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We had another question that was from fairly early on by Shreyas Kushik. How does the course, especially in breakout rooms, reduce the burden on underrepresented people in STEM to teach others and often thereby relive trauma? We've heard about this occurring in many places, right? Where you know, a person of color is kind of made to represent their entire
identity, yeah,
cohort identity for other people. Can you talk about how you kind of address this kind of phenomenon within the course?
Sure, absolutely. So I was really fortunate to have several course coordinators who were involved in the course design with me. So figuring out which papers to read or which media to look at each week. And why it was so important is that we also had taken some trainings on how to have difficult conversations, right? So then each breakout room always had one course coordinator associated with it so that we could make sure that there was someone facilitating the conversation, and if things started to go off the rails, to sort of put them back in the right position, and also to reduce that burden on individuals having to explain what their own experiences have been like or what they've heard from others, that really we could take it back down to what is the data and the papers we're reading saying, instead of relying on other individuals to educate us.
Perfect, thank you. Daniel Copeland Block checks in. Dr. Moreau, what would you advise the Jennifers and LaQuishas of the world to ask or say to potential employers when they believe they've actually been treated unfairly? How do we talk about people kind of, I don't know, handling it on their own if that's indeed the situation they're in?
Well, so first off, I would say the bigger problem is that these issues are going on, and the onus is not on them to limit that or stop that.
Yeah.
But hopefully there's some ability to report within an institution, whether it's anonymously or not. Because I guarantee you, if one person is feeling this, lots of people are, and they just are probably not aware of it. Now, the person who's causing the issue may or may not be aware that their behavior is troubling. And so sometimes it's just about education of that individual. So I would argue that the onus is not on the target, right? So we really need to focus more on the perpetrator.
Perfect. I'm so glad I asked that question. So there's a little bit of chatter here. Sarah, just to address your question, you did not need to prove that you were a Cornell alum. That was just voluntary information in case alums were joining this particular event. So no one was forbidden from joining us, as many of you know. But there is a through line in the conversation here, which is, what is the experience? I'll just talk anecdotally and try to combine several questions into one, but several people express that their particular industries, they work in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or some related field, don't see the same, don't perceive things to be the same as it is in an Ivy League university. Can you kind of explain how you perceive things as it relates from Cornell to some of the data here that comes from the field?
Absolutely. So, in many sort of bigger institutions and Ivy Leagues, we're seeing sort of both a bottom-up approach, but we're also seeing a top-down, right? So here at Cornell, our president has been very proactive in sort of saying we are going to take steps to eliminate or at least reduce bias, racism, and exclusion. But at the same time, there's been this groundswelling from students and faculty saying we need to limit this in our own circles as well. Now, at smaller institutions, you may not have the leadership with the vision yet, but it doesn't mean you can't sort of use that grassroots growing from the ground up to push some of these measures. So I've been at institutions where we didn't have that sort of top-down approach, and I built my own diversity in whatever field organizations, and I brought people together and we identified solutions to the issues in our own institutions. And so I would argue that anyone with desire can find a way to implement these in their own institutions. And feel free to lean on and reach out to colleagues who might be at sister institutions to sort of band together to figure out how to best tackle the issues that are maybe unique to your own organization.
Right, and that's the theme that certainly emerged, which is networking is absolutely crucial and vital for anything to happen and create change. Acharya asks, I am a woman who is in STEM but decided not to follow the tenure track but still work in academia. Any recommendations for how someone who has leaked out of the system can become an effective mentor? So let's talk about mentorship, how you kind of learn to take this on to yourself and deliver training for others, for instance, right? I don't know, what's your experience been like?
Yeah, so I want to say two things. One of which I want to say is that there's this thought, especially for people who are going on in PhDs in STEM fields, that if you don't become an academic and you don't stay in universities, that you have an alternative career, is what you often heard it called. And I would argue that there's no such thing as an alternative career. There are only diverse career options. And we know that we need people with undergraduate and degrees and PhDs in STEM fields, right, and related fields that are not academics. We don't need only academics. So I want to say that first. But then serially, acting as a mentor is critical. So anybody who's involved in the academy knows that many of the individuals getting their degrees at whatever career level already actively know that they don't want to become a professor themselves. So I think having the opportunity to share your experiences and tell them alternate ways in which you're using your particular degree, other fields that you know of, other industries that are employing individuals is always very helpful. You can also share if the reason you left was because of the climate. You can help work to ensure that the climate they're experiencing isn't similar to what you had to go through.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you so much. Yele checks in and says, I've observed similar experiences in health policy, law, economics, etc. By the way, I should just tell you that she said your talk is absolutely mind-blowing. Thank you for your candid perspective. So the question is, thanks, Yele, please share advice for women on how to build a stronger inner reserve to keep going and to not give up. This is demoralizing. This is something that you hadn't really talked about this within your talk, but again, I work in this field quite a bit. I hear this is something, how do we build resilience within ourselves to just...
Sure. So one of which is you really need to identify your support networks, and that shouldn't be a passive process. You need to think like, who do I lean on when I'm having these kinds of issues, both within your field, but maybe even outside. You should also identify role models. So remember, role models don't know that you're their role model, right? Or that, you think of them as that way, but have someone you want to aspire to be and have it be somebody who's achievable, right? You don't want to sort of say, I'm going to become Superman because, none of us can actually be Superman, but you might say, there was an undergrad advisor of mine who I thought was just the most upstanding and intelligent person I'd met. I'm going to think of her as my role model. I want to try to achieve what she's achieved. Then you also need to have mentors, right? So you need to have the people that you can go to for advice, that you have identified and asked, can you serve as a role model? And when you show up to meet with them, come with clear sets of questions and conversations you want to have. Recognizing that the more experience you get and the more exposure you receive in your field, the more confidence you're going to build in yourself. And I want to say something for a minute about imposter syndrome. I participate in a program here at Cornell that was designed and executed entirely by graduate students. It's an amazing program called Diversity Preview Weekend. And this was all their own vision, where they recognized that a lot of underrepresented individuals weren't even applying to grad school because they didn't know how, they didn't know what the process was. They maybe didn't even know how to write a resume or CV, what was in a personal statement. So they created a program where they bring a cohort in every year. Now, I'm fortunate because I get the opportunity to help serve as a mentor in some of that programming. So I do mock interviews with candidates and things. And one of the students had asked specifically to do her mock interview with me because she knew of my work. So we did our mock interview, and at the end of it, I sort of break it down to an informal session and just said, do you have any other questions? And she said, well, I've followed your work for so long, you're doing so well in your field. Did you ever have a time in your career where you had imposter syndrome? And that was kind of surprising to me because it had never occurred to me that everyone has imposter syndrome. Like, that's just a fact. There is not a person on this planet who does not have imposter syndrome in some form. But of course, we know that women and other historically excluded groups tend to have it much more severely. Now, what I shared with this individual is that although I still experience imposter syndrome from time to time, it's far less frequent. The voice in my head is far less critical, and it's far less loud. And so really it's because I've had all these opportunities to sort of build my own career, become an expert and recognize what I know and what I don't know. And that's helped limit my own imposter syndrome.
Thank you. Very helpful. I'm going to combine two difficult questions, but I hope it's not too much. There's another theme that's kind of emerging here. Lee asks, can you speak more about the importance of ensuring equitable systems versus individual actions? Again, I know there's no short answer to that, but I really like the way you spoke to that moments ago. So again, can you kind of revisit that? I think you understand where we need to go with that.
Sure. So of course there's systematic racism and bias that's embedded in all of our institutions. And the only way we're really going to overcome that is through policy changes, right? So we have to make clear policies that say these things will not be permitted under any situation, and that we have to assess ourselves frequently to see if it's creeping back in. Now, when I say in our institutions, this could be in your own department, it could be a small department, right? But that's not an individual's sort of field, right? And so, of course, there's the institutional level, but then there's also the individual level. So you can have an institution that is, at the gold star standard for diversity and equity inclusion. And you can still have individuals who are highly biased and are problematic, right? And so we have to sort of work on both simultaneously. Now, of course, we can sort of each individually work to limit our own biases, and we can try to sort of limit the bias of our colleagues. But I tend to think of individuals as sort of on a spectrum of education and interest. Those who are highly committed to STEM, right, DEI, and those that really maybe don't know or don't care. And some of these individuals you could spend the majority of your time having conversations with, and you're unlikely to move them much. Where it's the individuals in between that through some education and careful conversations and showing them data are more likely to lean towards believing that these are issues that they want to solve themselves. Now, the more people you can get over here, the more sort of power you have with your institution to help reinforce policy and even develop policy if it's not already in place.
Beautiful. I've got a good one here from D. Young Tae Chung, who asks, the art on the wall behind you is intriguing. Who did it? What are we looking at?
That's a great question. So this photograph over here is of one of my favorite, it is my favorite ant in the world. This is Cephalodius varians, the Florida turtle ant. And this photograph was actually taken by an undergraduate who works in my lab, Stephen Wang. So if you want to look up, he has beautiful insect photographs. And these bird images over here are from a local artist in Chicago that I really liked. And so picked them up when I was in Chicago.
Perfect. Great question, D. Young Tae Chung. This was kind of an interesting one. May not be so easy to answer, but I really love it. Let's see. Apologies. I thought I had it queued up. Someone asked, given that you've taught the course once, is there anything that you'd immediately want to change about it? Any hard lessons learned or just kind of aha moments that might have hit you that said, next time we're going to do this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think one of the things that I learned, and it was sort of intentional, is that we have these course coordinators. I will say that I think they're absolutely critical. So I don't think I could teach the class without having multiple individuals to be helping facilitate conversations. Yeah. That's something I definitely learned. The only things that I sort of, so it's a pie in the sky. So of course, the portions of the class that the students liked the most was when we got to the advances we've already made and the sort of how do we continue to build momentum. And of course, the tougher conversations were around, look how terrible we're doing in some ways. Mm-hmm. So I hope that if I continue to teach this course in 30 years, it's like one class on what we're still not getting right, and all the remaining classes on what we're getting right and how well we've done. So I guess that would be sort of like what I would aim for ultimately. But we're actually in the process of trying to write up kind of a how-to paper on to teach a class like this. I mean, it'll include sort of, how to actively, run it smoothly, what we thought worked well and what we are, would like to change in the future. So keep your eye out for that.
Perfect. And I think we can all expect great things. So audience, I do have a key recommendation. Please follow Dr. Corey Moreau on Twitter. It's all happening there. Check out the Moreau Lab URL that I've shared earlier in the chat. So those are two things. That's where you can start. Again, we've shared the syllabus and some other links, but I think more than anything else, check out Dr. Corey Moreau on Twitter, follow her there, and you'll continue to learn much more and be certainly plugged into things that are going on in this world. Great audience chat. Thanks everybody for joining. We clearly had a global audience with everyone seems to share similar experiences no matter where you go. This is how it's going now, and it's all for the better. So thank you, audience. Dr. Moreau, it's been an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to, I hope that we can see each other in person again and do it sometime soon. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You bet. Thanks, audience. We'll see you next time for the keynote. Remember, this was recorded. We'll have the recording available just moments after we're through tonight. So I want to thank you all so much. Stay strong, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.